This is C-SPAN's Afterwards podcast. This week, Wall Street Journal columnist Jason Riley on the life and career of economist Thomas Sowell. His book is called Maverick, a biography of Thomas Sowell. He's interviewed by nationally syndicated talk show host Dennis Prager.
Jason Riley, it's a pleasure to be with you. We have been together on my radio show. You have made a number of PragerU videos, and I read you in the Wall Street Journal. You're pretty ubiquitous in my life. I just want you to know that.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
Good. You have done a service to the intellectual life of America by writing a biography of Thomas Sowell. And I'll begin in an odd way. How do you explain, I think I know the answer, nevertheless, I want your answer. How do you explain that one of the finest minds of the last half century is unknown to half America?
Well, I guess to use today's parlance, Thomas Sowell was canceled. He was canceled a long time ago. He's a conservative. He's a Black conservative. And way back in the 1970s, when he began writing about racial controversies, he got in trouble with a lot of his fellow intellectuals in the academy and in the media. And he's never really shook that. I think it's something that has cost him professionally in terms of notoriety. And it's probably the main reason a lot of people today know names like Ta-Nehisi Coates or Nicole Hannah-Jones or Ibram Kendi or Cornel West, but not Thomas Sowell. Notwithstanding the fact that he's really written circles around those folks, maybe all of them combined. And not only in terms of the breadth of his work, but also the rigor of his analysis, I think, is really unmatched by those folks. Yet they remain much better known than Thomas Sowell. And that's one of the reasons I wanted to write the book.
God, it's a truly important book. Was anything surprising in your research?
Well, I'd followed Sowell's career for quite a while. And I've been trying to get him to cooperate with me in writing this book for a long time as well. And had interviewed him over the years a number of times and got to know him a little bit. So not too much surprised me. I guess one thing that might surprise a lot of people, though, is what a late start Sowell got in his professional life. This is someone who did not graduate from college until the age of 28. He was a high school dropout and did not write his first book until he was 40. And when you think about how prolific he's been, it's quite amazing just how late a start he got in terms of his career.
So let's go to his beginnings. Again, folks, we're talking about Thomas Sowell, in my opinion, as I said earlier, one of the greatest thinkers, period, not just one of the greatest economists, one of the greatest social thinkers. And courageous. You have to be both, by the way. You can't be great without courage in the last half century. By the way, before we go I want to go to his childhood for a moment, but it is fair, I think, for me to say he's not at all just an economist.
Oh, no. Tom is a social theorist, a historian, sociologist, and an economist. He's dabbled in any number of fields. It's often got him in trouble with people who specialize, who get very protective of their turf sometimes. But the writer Mark Halperin has called Thomas Sowell one of the great trespassers among our intellectuals. But his first discipline, what he was schooled in, is economics and economic history, the history of economic thought and the history of ideas.
So a brief synopsis of his childhood.
Well, he was born in 1930 in North Carolina, outside of Charlotte, and spent almost the first decade of his life there. He was orphaned as a child. His father died before he was born, and his mother died giving birth to a younger sibling a few years later. So he never knew his parents, and he was taken in by a great aunt who and her two adult daughters, one of whom was married. And so the four of them, when Tom was about 9 years old, moved up to Harlem in New York City, where he was raised. And as I mentioned earlier, he was a high school dropout. He was a very smart kid, but had somewhat of a tumultuous home life, and ended up dropping out of high school and then leaving home at the age of 17. Eventually, he was drafted into the Marines during the Korean War, and spent 2 years in the Marines. And I think he sort of got his act together there, learned some discipline, also picked up photography, which became a lifelong love of his. And on the GI Bill, with money from the GI Bill, he was able to enroll in college, first at Howard University, the black school in Washington, D.C., and then he transferred to Harvard, where he eventually got his undergraduate degree. And from there, he went on to first to Columbia for a master's in economics, and then on to the University of Chicago, where he studied under Milton Friedman and received his PhD. And then he spent most of the 60s and the 70s teaching various schools, Amherst, Brandeis, UCLA, and Cornell. And then in 1980, he joined the Hoover Institution, which is at Stanford University, and that's where he's been ever since.
If there were no Hoover Institution, would a mainstream university have hired him?
Tom could have worked at any college, any university he wanted to. This is a man who turned down offers from places like Dartmouth, University of Wisconsin. He could have gotten tenure and worked at any economics department in the country. It's quite clear. He was a quite talented scholar in his discipline before he ever began writing about racial controversies and so forth. Just the number of academic publications and so forth, or just surpassed most people in the field. What Tom ran into trouble with was the faculty lounge, the college administrators who wanted to interfere with his teaching style and so forth. And I think part of the problem was this was the 1960s, Dennis, and higher education was changing. You had a women's rights movement, a gay rights movement, an anti-war movement. All these things were coming together. College campuses were being used as platforms for this sort of thing. And Tom was of a different generation. I think he intended to teach the way he was taught. And that was hard. Starting in the 1960s, that became very, very difficult to do. The professors and the administrators were encouraged to be much more indulgent than anything Tom had experienced, and he just would not bend. And so I think it reached a head for him at Cornell in the late 60s. He was there for the student protest. He was on the faculty at the time, and I think that might have been the breaking point for him. And he stuck it out through the 70s. He sort of had one foot in the think tank world already throughout most of the 70s, but he eventually, by the end of the 70s, decided to leave teaching altogether. But his first love had been classroom teaching, not even research. He wanted to be a teacher.
I was probably a great teacher. By the way, I was thinking, when you talked about his childhood, did he have a father figure?
It's interesting. He had, yes, one of his, the great aunt that raised him had two daughters, one of whom was married. And that man was something of a father figure. But when Tom talks about that experience, it's not just that he had a father figure. It's that he was essentially an only child raised by four adults. And he talks about how important that was in his child development. And I mean, we know through studies on how well firstborn child does or only children do. He says, I was lucky enough to be raised by four adults. And he says that probably had more impact on how I turned out than anything else that's ever happened to me in my life.
I'm just thinking, I wonder if that's a relatively ignored field. People talk about the influences in childhood, and I wonder if the fact that kids today spend more time with kids rather than adults than perhaps in recorded history. And I wonder if that's having an immaturing impact on thought and personality? I'm just freely associating here based on what you said.
It might. I'm not too familiar with that literature, but we do know that a lot of these gaps, these academic achievement gaps that we're still dealing with and constantly trying to close, do begin even before the children enter school. I mean, we know the sort of words per hour studies that have been done, and you break those down by income level and so forth. Children on welfare, children on working class parents, children of professional parents, huge disparities, not only in the number of words, but in the how many negative words versus positive words a child hears can be quite different depending on the socioeconomic background of the family. But in Tom's case, and at this time, you know, the Black family was in much better shape than it is today. You know, intact families were the norm in the Black community back then. You know, in the 1920s and 30s and 40s, Black marriage rates were higher than white marriage rates in this country. So a lot of what we see today is really more of a legacy of the 1960s than a legacy of Jim Crow or slavery, as it's often attributed to.
Try to say that on a college campus today. Oh my God. It has the detriment.
I mean, Tom grew up in Harlem, but Harlem was not this violent neighborhood with gunfire, and it wasn't that's, you know, a lot of people don't understand that. Harlem was not, you know, what it became later. And so Tom might have grown up in Harlem, but it was a very different place back then.
Also, is it fair to say, and feel totally free to say it's not fair to say, but I think that most Americans today, Black and white, have a picture of Black life prior to the 60s as utter servitude, humiliation, non-achievement, you know, which is such a distorted picture. Obviously, there was the evil of Jim Crow. We all understand that. But, you know, Jesse Owens was an American hero in 1932 or 36. I don't remember which Olympics it was, in Berlin, when to Hitler's great chagrin, it was a Black runner who beat all of his Aryan runners. People don't know that, though, do they?
They don't. And Tom has spent quite a bit of time writing about this period in Black history that's often overlooked. What was going on between the end of slavery, through Reconstruction, through the Jim Crow era, and before the modern day civil rights movement. And he's charted the progress that was being made. And it was remarkable progress. You saw gaps closing, income gaps closing. The poverty rate, for example, in America for Blacks fell by 40 percentage points between 1940 and 1960. That's before a Civil Rights Act, before a Voting Rights Act. You had Blacks entering the skilled professions, middle class professions, social workers, teachers, doctors, lawyers, accountants. The number of them quadrupled between 1930 and 1970. That's before affirmative action. And you're right, this period is not discussed, or not discussed to the extent that it should be. And I think that's because it really interferes with the prevailing narrative, which is that what we see, these outcomes we see today among low-income Blacks, is a legacy of slavery and a legacy of Jim Crow. If you point out to them that Blacks were progressing at a much faster rate in generations much closer to slavery and Jim Crow than they are today, it really interferes with that narrative that the left often pushes and that the Democrats often push. So
again, please tell me if this is a wrong read in your opinion, but one of the, if not the central motto of a conservative is, please leave me alone. That's basically what we want, is to be left alone. We would like to make our own life, make our own mistakes, fall on our faces, pick ourselves up. Is it at all fair to say that had in effect Blacks been left alone with no Jim Crow, that's not being left alone, and right, no, we'll help you immensely, would that have been better?
Well, I don't even think it's a theoretical question. It's something that can be answered empirically by looking at trends among blacks at a period of time when the government, excuse my French, didn't give a damn what was happening to black people. And to the extent that the government was involved, it was an oppressor. And if you look again at the progress being made among blacks in terms of income and joining skilled professions, educational attainment, not only in absolute terms, but relative to whites, if you look at these trend lines, you see tremendous progress in the first half of the 20th century. And then when the great welfare state expansions of the 1960s come along with the Great Society and so forth, well-intentioned, but if you chart this progress that was going on among blacks, at that point, all of these things either slow, stall, or start to reverse course. Just to give you a quick statistic, violent crime among blacks today is something, of course, that is front page news. It was declining in the first half of the 20th century. In the 1940s, it fell by 18%. And in the 1950s, it fell by another 21%, all the while remaining relatively flat among whites. And this was particularly remarkable because this was the time that a lot of blacks were moving from rural settings to urban settings where you typically find more violence. Yet the violent crime rate among blacks, homicides and so forth, was falling dramatically. All of this starts to reverse course beginning in the late 60s, and then it goes on into the 70s and gets worse and worse well into the early 1990s. So again, I don't think it's something that's really theoretical. It's something that can be shown factually. What Thomas said about this is that the real, and this gets to your point about this, your leave us alone point. What the civil rights movement did that was most valuable was to get the government off the backs of black people, particularly in the South, with respect to the Jim Crow laws. That was the great achievement of the civil rights movement in busting Jim Crow. To the extent that the government has tried to play a positive role, affirmative action and quotas and so on, it's had a deleterious effect. You can chart the rise of the welfare state with the rise of fatherless homes in the black community. So yes, the leave us alone strategy, I think, was the better strategy. And there were blacks, at the time who said so. That's one of, that's your Frederick Douglasses and your Booker T. Washingtons. That was their attitude.
So with regard to no community, is it probably as true as it is with regard to black Americans? Ronald Reagan's famous statement, the government is not the solution, it's the problem.
Yes, I think so. And that was sort of how, Thomas Sowell started out as a Marxist. He started out thinking that the government did have a positive role to play. And through his 20s, he remained a Marxist. Even after studying economics under Milton Friedman at the University of Chicago, Sowell was still a Marxist. And he says that what changed his mind was working in the government, in the Department of Labor one summer. And what he saw was that the government was not always a benevolent force, and that it could be a quite harmful force, particularly when it comes to low-income minority groups. And in his case, it came after a study of minimum wage laws and what they were doing in terms of their effects on employment.
You mentioned studying under Milton Friedman. Did Milton Friedman have a big impact on him?
Yes, in several ways. Milton Friedman, I think one of the bigger impacts that Milton Friedman had on Sowell was on Sowell's public intellectualism, what he's best known for today. And what I mean by that is that after Friedman left teaching in the 70s, after he'd won his Nobel Prize and left the University of Chicago, he set about writing popular books that could be read and understood by general interest readers, people who were not economists or intellectuals. He did a lot of speaking to such groups on college campuses and elsewhere. He felt that the role of a scholar, of an intellectual, was not simply to talk to your peers in the academy, but to explain your discipline to people who were not steeped in the discipline. And Sowell has very much followed that model. He's written book after book after book in plain English, plain spoken prose for everyday people. And it's one of the reasons a lot of people were so disappointed when he gave up his column a few years back. I think even after Tom left teaching, he was still teaching through that column. And as I said at the time, he was the best professor a lot of people had, even if they never went to college. And I think Sowell's public intellectualism to some extent was modeled on what Friedman had done. Friedman was a mentor of his.
Had he studied under a persuasive left-wing economist, do you think he would have turned out differently?
I don't, no, probably not. Sowell's very much his own man. He wasn't indoctrinated by Friedman or Stigler. George Stigler was another Nobel Prize-winning economist that Sowell studied under at Chicago. He studied under Gary Becker when he was at Columbia working on his master's, and Becker was there teaching. But no, I mean, and Friedman has pointed this out. Sowell is his own man. As I said, even after studying under Friedman, he was still a Marxist. Sowell's someone who's had to figure this stuff out for himself, and I don't think a professor would have changed his mind. He's been very independent minded for a very, very long time.
I know that. That's very fair to say. What was his first big hit?
His book, first big book.
Yeah.
I would say probably Ethnic America, which came out in, I want to say 1981. Was a very big hit. It got a tremendous amount of coverage. Sold a lot of copies, and it's a book about different ethnic groups that have come to the U.S. He traces their history, and he's also talking in there about the importance of culture in a group's upward mobility, and how if you have what economists call the right human capital, if you've developed the human capital, the right attitudes and skills and habits and behaviors that are conducive to economic advancement, you're going to be okay, even if larger society discriminates against you. And you can see examples of this not only here in the U.S. when it comes to groups like the Japanese, but you can see it in other countries, the ethnic Chinese in Southeast Asia, or Jews in Eastern Europe, and so forth. If you have that human capital, even if you are banned from certain schools or certain occupations, these groups that have that human capital seem to be able to rise nevertheless.
In my understanding, the moment you say values determine behavior, you are no longer on the left. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I think that's a pretty fair statement.
And that I know that book. That's I didn't realize that was his first big one. When did Basic Economics come out?
The first edition of Basic Economics, wow, I want to say around 2000.
Oh, that late. Oh, 20 years later.
I could be wrong, but I want to say it's something like the 5th edition now, but I want to say around 2000. I don't quote me on that. But
no, that's fine.
I want to say.
So I was just curious. In my brain, Basic Economics, because of the title, Basic, I thought that was one of the first that ever came out.
Well, his first book that he ever wrote was an economics textbook.
Okay. It wasn't a hit.
It was a traditional economics textbook, full of charts and graphs. Basic Economics is an economics textbook. Its beauty is that it has no charts and graphs in it. And Thomas said it was much, much more difficult to write than the first one he wrote.
You'll love this. When I had him on for Basic Economics, which I think could be the dullest title of any book that I've ever interviewed the author of, I actually said to him on my radio show, Tom, you really should have consulted with me. I'm good at titles. Like, let's admit, Tom Sowell's Guide to Bikinis would have done much better. And he laughed so hard that I knew I was with a real person. He just guffawed.
It's his best-selling book. Basic Economics is his best-selling
really?
book. It's sold
Maybe
more
I'm
copies
wrong.
than anything else he's ever written. It's been translated into 7 or 8 different languages. So he might make an argument for the title.
Yeah, that's right. All right, maybe ethnic bikinis, and then we got to get bikini into one of his titles. But I love joking around with him, and he laughs so easily. I don't know if people know that. I'm sure you encountered that.
Yes.
And he's so proud of his photography. He makes sure that I see some of his. He's good. He's
very good. Yeah, he's very good. Yeah.
I don't blame him. So what is his, to the extent that we're free to speak about it, what's his personal life like? Married, children, what's his story?
Well, this is mostly an intellectual biography. I talk about I talk about some aspects of his personal life, and he's written about his personal life in his columns over the years, and in a couple books he's gotten into it. He wrote a semi-biographical book called Black Education, Myths and Tragedies back in the early 70s, where he talked about his upbringing, and he wrote a memoir called A Personal Odyssey, which came out in the late 1990s, I believe. And he's married. He has a couple kids. He's written more extensively about one of his children, his son, who was a late talker in life. And after his son graduated from college, Tom wrote a column about how late he had started to talk and how worried his parents had been at the time. And this produced a flood of letters from other parents who had gone through something similar. And the volume of mail was so great that Tom decided to write a book called Late Talking Children. And he couldn't find a lot of books out there about these kinds of kids. They tend to be male. They tend to be very musically oriented. They have great memories. There's not a lot else that is wrong with them other than that they just start talking much later than most kids do. But it is a phenomenon, and he wrote about it, and he actually wrote 2 books about the topic, and so he has written about his son.
To be personal on my end for a moment, I didn't speak till past 3. My grandfather was sure I was retarded. He told my parents that. In those days, you could use that term.
Yeah.
And excuse me. And my argument has always been that why would I talk? I started talking when I could charge for it. So there was nothing in it for
you
me.
Made up for lost time.
Yes, exactly right. But I did not know he wrote that book. I know someone who has a boy, and she's very worried. He's almost 2, and I'm going to give her that book. I hope it's, well, I'm sure I can get it, even if it's not in print. But that is so typical of Tom Sowell, to do something on an issue has nothing to do with economics. And so he, as you pointed out, you used a great term of his just, there are no boundaries to his thinking.
Yeah.
He also, you have the sense he loves life.
Yes.
Right?
Well, I hope so, because he's going to be 91 this year. So I hope he's enjoying it. He's had a very long one.
Good. I hope he has many more. That's the case. So what, if there's such a thing, if you could recommend one book to start people off of Tom Sowell, what would you recommend?
Well, he put out a book called The Thomas Sowell Reader. I want to say back in the mid-2000s, but it might have been a little later. And it's kind of a sampling of chapters from books he's written, as well as columns on various topics: politics, race, culture, economics, and so forth. And that might be a good way to start. If you want to go a little deeper, however, the book of which Tom is proudest is called A Conflict of Visions. And it's a book that came out in the mid-'80s, 1987, I believe. And it's really a book about political philosophy. And Tom is tracing the origins of a lot of our ideological disputes about justice and equality and human nature. And he traces them back hundreds of years. and to people like Rousseau and William Godwin and folks like that. And what he's really describing there are these two visions of human nature. He calls them the constrained vision and the unconstrained vision, or sometimes he calls the constrained vision the tragic vision and the unconstrained vision the utopian vision. And in the constrained vision, there's a sense that there are problems we want to solve but are unlikely to solve. Hunger, war, crime, racism, and so forth. And because we can't solve these problems, what we need to do is to put in place institutions and processes that help us deal with problems we can't solve. So while we all might want world peace, we're probably not going to get it. So you need a defense department. We may want to end racism and crime and so forth, but it's probably not going to happen. So you need courts of law and a judiciary to adjudicate disputes and so forth. And so you have one view that comes from that perspective. And the other vision, this utopian vision or unconstrained vision, essentially says that no, man is essentially perfectible. If we just ration our way and rationalize or have the willpower, we can solve all of these problems and there'll be no trade-offs. And Thomas said that these two visions of humanity, of human nature, are really what it would have been driving our various disputes for hundreds of years, and he traces their origins. And the reason I think that's a book that will help you get inside of Sowell's head is because no matter what he's writing about, whether it's a racial issue, a cultural issue, an economic issue, he's really operating in this framework of a constrained vision point of view versus an unconstrained vision point of view. And that book really lays it out.
It cannot be stated how important that is. The great evils of the 20th century, the bloodiest recorded century we know of, emanate from utopian communism, which killed the most people, way more than Nazism, only because the Nazis didn't have as long a time to do it. But it's completely based on a utopian or unconstrained vision of what is possible, and we're seeing that happen in the U.S. today. A country free of racism. What does that even mean? You know, I'm a Jew. Do I expect a country free of anti-Semitism? The idea is preposterous to me. There will always be anti-Semites. The question is whether your society is anti-Semitic, not whether there are anti-Semites. It's their children. It's one could almost say it's an adult vision versus a child's vision, right? I mean, isn't that a fair way of putting it?
Well, it is in the sense that the unconstrained view is more of an aesthetic, as someone I interviewed for the book explained it. It's a preference for how the world should be, and it can be completely divorced from any reality. I mean, they never answer the question, can you do this? Is it possible? And at what cost is it possible? Because on this utopian view, there are no trade-offs. There are no costs. Right. Everybody can have everything. They're also coming at it, as Thomas explained. There's a view, and Tom has written volumes about this, literally. This view that human capital is distributed evenly among groups, and therefore we should see equal outcomes, or at least proportionate outcomes, in things like income or education, or and all kinds of facets of our lives. But people who have actually studied societies down through history have never found the sameness in outcomes that is held up today as a norm. The norm is disparate outcomes, not proportionate outcomes among groups and so forth. Even in countries that are ethnically and racially homogenous, you do not find equal outcomes. And the idea that you'd find them in America, a place where people have come from so many different places, geographies with so many different histories, in terms of things they focus on and prioritize, that you put them all together in America and get some sort of sameness in outcomes is just off the mark to begin with. The whole premise is off the mark. And yet today we have people out there who hold up this view of proportionate outcomes as the norm. And then where they don't see it, they assume something nefarious must be going on. And again, it's the progressives who are largely driving this view. And as Thomas pointed out, they've been doing this for a long time. You go back 100 years ago, and you had the progressives telling us that genetics determined outcomes and were responsible for the disparities in outcomes among groups. And of course, you get to eugenics through that thinking. You fast forward 100 years, and now it's discrimination is the sole decider of the sole blame for disparate outcomes that we have today. Once again, they have seized on a cause and made it the cause, and they're wrong once again. But that is the type of thinking that we're dealing with, and as Thomas pointed out, that's a type of thinking that has a long history.
There's one area that at least not yet have they infected with the idea of equitable outcomes, and that's sports. It doesn't seem to bother them at this point the disproportionate number of blacks in the NBA or disproportionate number of whites in hockey. So
yeah, I think that they're very good at compartmentalizing certain things, and particularly if something disrupts that narrative that I spoke about earlier. So today, again, using discrimination as the sole factor, the sole explainer of disparate outcomes, they always run into problems whenever you include Asians in the equation. I mean, if you want to talk about bank loans and whites getting approved for loans at higher rates than blacks, well, Asians get approved at higher rates than whites. Or you talk about school discipline, where black boys are suspended or expelled at higher rates than whites. Well, whites are expelled and suspended at higher rates than Asians. So so they just stop. They don't talk about that. they read the data to the point where they can make whatever point they're trying to make, and then they stop and they ignore anything that sort of interferes with that narrative. So I think that's what you see going on here with the sports you were just talking about.
So let me pose a challenge to you, and I would to Tom as well, if he were on with us right now. There seems to be one arena which is largely ignored by people that I so admire, and that is the role of the church and religion in people's lives. We who are on the conservative side, and black conservatives in particular, will emphasize how the government, of course, as you pointed out so eloquently, doesn't help, in fact hurts, and how much government policy has hurt black life. But the out of wedlock birth rate of whites has gone up tremendously, and I see it as directly correlated with religious identification and church attendance. As that's gone down, out of wedlock birth rates have gone up. Do you see a role for this in the problems that face black life generally?
I do. It's not something that I've come across in Sowell's research, other than when he writes about decision making and the various institutions in society that groups count on to help them make decisions, feedback loops of information and so forth. The religion and the church is certainly one of those areas. And so to the extent that you see less church attendance, it's going to have a negative impact. I would also point to the role that the church or religion has played in helping other ethnic minority groups rise. And I can think of the Irish in particular, who came here from a rural country, very poor, and were very slow to rise economically in America. The Catholic Church had a big role in turning that around, helping Irish immigrants assimilate, setting up schools, setting up hospitals, and so forth. So we do have an example of how central a role the church can play. And there are still churches, black churches today, that are playing a similar role. The Black Church is still one of the few functioning institutions in some of these poor Black communities, and I think they have their work cut out. I've talked to some ministers about this in the past, and one of the problems they point out to me is that it's the women who show up in the pews, but it's the men they're trying to reach, and that's part of the challenge.
Yeah, but so I thought that was worth noting. So on a very difficult subject, you listed these names of Black quote unquote thinkers that are extremely popular: Ibram X. Kendi and Ta-Nehisi Coates and so on. Whenever I've read them, I've actually almost wept when I compare them to Tom Sowell, or for that matter to you, to be perfectly honest. There's no intellectual rigor. They're just outbursts with claims made with no bases. How do you account for them? Is it simply that the establishment media agree with them, and that's the whole issue?
It's a large part of the issue. I don't know if it's the whole issue, but they certainly do have the media on their side, and not just the media. Dennis, when I mentioned earlier that Sowell had been canceled, he was an academic, and you think about not just who controls the media, ideologically, but who controls the academy. Who's in charge of the committees that hands out awards and prizes in intellectual circles? These are all left liberal groups, all left liberal intellectuals, and they have been able to accommodate the intellectuals that they want to, and sort of cancel the ones that they don't. So yes, that has played a large role. One of the questions that Sowell would often get asked during interviews, and I watched hundreds of hours of interviews with him and research for the book, is he'd often be asked, how does it feel to be so out of step with other Blacks in your views? And he would always correct the interviewer and say, you don't mean I'm out of step with other Blacks, you mean I'm out of step with other Black elites. And he would say, Black elites are no more representative of Black people than white elites are of white people, and you can't conflate the two. And so you talk about an issue like voter ID laws or canceling the police, defunding the police. These are views that where the Black elites, the ones we were just discussing, and the ones in the media, their views are not held by the Black community, the people who live in these neighborhoods and so forth. Voter ID laws are supported by a majority of Blacks. Right. Most people who live in these Black communities want more police.
Or school choice.
And so oftentimes the media is guilty of running to these Black elites and accepting their opinion as the opinion of Black people. And this is by no means a new phenomenon. You can go back to say the busing wars of the 70s and 80s, where you had groups like the NAACP supporting busing, when polls showed that most Blacks did not support busing. And so this is a very old phenomenon.
And as I mentioned, school choice. I mean,
yes. that another good example.
That's huge. But so okay. So what is, if this is true, why do Blacks keep voting Democrat?
Well, it's not a phenomenon, I think, unique to Blacks. I'll give you an example. In 2020, there was a referendum, Prop 16 out in California, that would have reinstated racial preferences in college admissions, something that California voters had rejected back in the 1990s. This was an effort to put them back in place. Asian Americans were part of the group that helped defeat this proposition. It
right, but they vote Democrat too.
But at the same time, they voted overwhelmingly
right.
for Joe Biden.
Right.
And you can look at the districts in California that are heavily Asian, and you see this disparity against Prop 16 for Joe Biden. So blacks aren't the only group that does this. There are other issues that
right. Well, let me tell you about.
And I will also add this. I think that part of the problem is also the lack of Republican outreach to blacks. There are some exceptions, but they remain largely exceptions. This is a vote that Republicans largely concede to the Democratic Party. Republicans typically do not go into these neighborhoods. They don't go into the barbershops. They don't go into the community centers. They don't go into the churches. They're not advertising on black radio or black television programs and social media sites. You have to go get this vote. And what that enables the Democrats to do is to paint the Republican opponent as a monster, and there's no pushback. So I think if Republicans want more black support, I think they're going to have to make more of an effort to go ask for it.
That's extremely significant. When I remember when I would hear about a Republican nominee for president who would be invited to an NAACP convention or banquet and not go, and I thought, what are you, nuts? You have a chance to get such exposure in the black community, and you're rejecting it. I wouldn't go through the civil rights establishment to get to. In other words, the black folks at an NAACP conference are probably lost to the Republican Party. They probably have a generation. Agreed, but
still takes the NAACP.
But black radio.
Al Sharpton seriously. I'd go around them. I'd go to the black colleges. I'd go to the barbershops. I'd go to the community centers. I would not go through the traditional civil rights leadership.
I hear you, and I agree with you. My thought was, but at the very least, segments of your talk will be played on black radio. I mean, I agree not to rely on the NAACP, which is a lost group, I think, idealistically. But I do believe, anyway, it doesn't matter. We agree. It would be great if they showed up. Did Donald Trump try this at least by saying, what do you have to lose?
If you consider that effective black outreach. Maybe.
Okay, that's fair. That's fair.
But
I understand.
I could think of more effective ways.
Arguments, right? Although there was truth to that. I mean, will it happen again in 2022 with all the crime rise, the violent crime overwhelmingly directed against blacks by blacks? Will blacks still vote Democrat in their cities, given these are the defund police crowd?
Well, again, I think it's going to depend on whether the Republican nominee goes and looks for these votes and courts these voters. That's what it's going to come down to. Is the Republican nominee going to go into these communities and ask for this vote? I think, the real story of blacks under Donald Trump is how well things were going in terms of employment, in terms of poverty, in terms of income, wage growth. Blacks were doing tremendously in the pre-COVID economy under Donald Trump. So it's clear that many of the policies he supported were policies that could help blacks advance in this country. And I think that the next Republican nominee ought to go remind black people of that in person in their communities. I think it's important to show up.
How is a black Republican regarded in mainstream black life?
An oddity, I think, very much still an oddity. And that's despite the fact that I think black Americans in the main hold quite conservative views on any number of issues. I mean, you mentioned school choice as one of them, but the Republican label is still a taint. Yes, very much so.
So that's been effective. It's been effective. You know, you mentioned the issue of it's not just black. So again, as I mentioned, I'm a Jew, and all my relatives are Jewish, and nearly all of them are Democrats. Thank God 100 times. It's not true for my sons and my wife, which is what is most important. But anyway, I tell my relatives whom I love, I said, I have a great line I think you would love. I say to them, why don't you preach what you practice? They live utterly conservative lives.
Yeah. Well, Sowell has argued for years that that one way for the Republican Party, one inroad that they would have if they took advantage of it is education, and given what has taken place with schooling under COVID, and how the teachers unions have behaved, and how blatantly they have shown themselves to be far more interested in leveraging the crisis for the benefit of their members than they are interested in helping kids and families. I think there's a huge opportunity here for Republicans to really run on that issue and keep that foremost in voters' minds, that this Democratic Party is in bed with these teachers' unions. Remember what the unions put you through, put your family through. Your kids couldn't go to school. You couldn't go to work. Do you want to continue to support a party that wants the unions to have this much control, not only over our schools, but by extension over our lives? And I think that is a message that Republicans would be wise to run on in both in the midterm elections and in the next presidential election.
We're coming to the end, unfortunately. This has really been wonderful talking to you. I'd like your analysis of the white progressive, the white leftist. The country is racist. Every white is a racist. Whites are fragile. It's generally argued that this comes from some, in my opinion, pathological guilt. I see it as more nefarious, as in many cases, just using blacks as a vehicle to power. Like the communists in the Soviet Union used workers. They didn't really care about workers. They used them to gain power. I'd love your reaction.
I think that the progressive left has given up on black people, and particularly black kids. I'm very, very disturbed by this movement against testing, standards of any kind. It's telling me that they don't believe black people can be held up to any standards, and therefore the standards must be eliminated, which is odd, because if you all the test is doing is showing us where the kid is. You eliminate the test, it doesn't mean the kid isn't still in that position. And if you want to help someone, they need to know where they are, not where you hope they are. They need to know where they actually are. And when you eliminate that test, all you're doing is obscuring where they are, and that's not how you help someone. I mean, one of Sowell's sayings is that when you want to help someone, you tell them what they need to hear. When you want to help yourself, you tell them what they want to hear. And I think your analysis is right here. These are progressives who are really more interested in helping themselves. But I think the other problem is that they've really decided that these kids will never measure up, that blacks in general will never measure up. This whole effort to decriminalize things, make things that are illegal no longer illegal, to accommodate disparities in behavior, to me says these people, these black people, have no agency. They're really incapable of ever doing X, Y, and Z. Therefore, we must eliminate these standards. Again, ignoring this entire history, black history, pre-1960s black history, when things were going in a much different direction in all kinds of measures, from crime and schooling to incomes and employment. So yeah, it's very disturbing to me. But it's where we are today.
I agree with you that this despair. You know, the New York Times has come out against blind auditions for the New York Philharmonic. They actually want musicians chosen on the basis of, quote, gender and race, and not who plays the oboe best behind a curtain.
Well, yeah.
So all it does is it cheapens the achievement of the black oboist. Are you great, or did they choose you for your color?
Yeah.
Well, listen, Jason Riley, you do magnificent work. Your biography of Thomas Sowell is extremely significant about one of the greatest thinkers, as I said, of the 20th century and indeed 21st century. So thank you for all your work. Keep writing, keep lecturing, and I look forward to being with you again.
Thank you, Dennis. Appreciate it.
Thanks for listening to C-SPAN's Afterwards podcast. You might be interested in C-SPAN's newest podcast, Book Notes Plus. Brian Lamb has wide-ranging conversations with authors and historians. The 30-minute podcast is available every Tuesday. Find it wherever you get your podcasts.